Chapter 21. A Brief Departure.
Mrs. Brocket reclined upon her fainting couch, her fingers trembling as she held the letter before her. The morning light, filtering through the drawing-room windows, cast a pallid glow upon the page, illuminating words that sent violent tremors through her constitution. "My dearest aunt," the letter began with nauseating sweetness, "I write with the most joyous news. Mr. Edmund Rothschild has asked for my hand in marriage." The remainder of the missive dissolved into an incomprehensible blur as Mrs. Brocket's vision narrowed to a pinpoint. Edmund Rothschild, the very same gentleman she had marked in her mind for Isabella's future prospects. The very same who possessed not only a substantial estate in Hampshire, but also shipping interests in the West Indies. "Impossible!" she wheezed, her free hand clutching at her chest. The room began to spin with the velocity of a deranged dancing master's instruction. "That scheming little—" Her heart, already straining against the injustice, gave a mighty lurch. Mrs. Brocket's last coherent thought before darkness claimed her was that her niece had committed an act of such profound social treachery that it bordered on the criminal. When awareness returned, Mrs. Brocket found herself floating near the ceiling, looking down upon a most peculiar scene. Her physical form lay sprawled across the fainting couch in what she considered a most undignified manner, while her family clustered around like vultures at a promising carcass. "Mamma!" Catherine wailed, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. "Oh, Mamma!" "Do cease that theatrical display," Mrs. Brocket attempted to say, but found her words had no effect whatsoever on the gathering below. Mr. Brocket stood at the periphery, absently polishing his spectacles. "Perhaps we ought to send for Dr. Morrison." "I should think not," Mrs. Brocket declared from her elevated position. "That man hasn't the sense God gave a goose." Marianne, kneeling beside the couch, tilted her head. "She looks rather peaceful, doesn't she? Like that time we found the cat sleeping in the butter churn. Though Mamma's considerably less furry, of course." Isabella, who had been checking for signs of life, straightened with a frown. "She's not breathing, Papa." "What nonsense!" Mrs. Brocket huffed. "I'm breathing perfectly well, thank you very much." "Caw, she's gone and done it then." Mabel's voice drifted in from the doorway. "Hopped her clogs right proper, she has. Want me to bucket her with water? See if it sorts her out. Got some here from cleaning out the sty." A hasty wave of brown, sludgy water emanated from the doorway, surging through the air to slap Mrs. Brocket across the face. "How dare you!" Mrs. Brocket attempted to swoop down and box the maid's ears, but found herself passing straight through Mabel's person. The sensation was most disagreeable. "Probably best we attempt to exercise a degree of caution and respect." Mr. Brocket's voice carried a note of reproach. "Respect?" Mabel snorted. "She never showed none to me, did she? Always ordering me about like some trained monkey. Mabel, fix the roof. Mabel, rebuild the chimney. Mabel, learn to play the pianoforte so we can save on hiring a musician for the next dinner party." Mrs. Brocket watched in mounting horror as her family failed to dismiss the impertinent servant. Instead, Catherine had begun sobbing in earnest, while Marianne patted her sister's shoulder with one hand and wiped off some sludge near their mother's mouth with the other. "This is absolutely intolerable," Mrs. Brocket declared to the unhearing room. "I demand you all stop this foolishness at once and bring my body a towel." Isabella had moved to the writing desk and was rifling through the correspondence. What's this letter she was reading? "Never you mind," Mrs. Brocket shrieked, attempting to snatch it away. Her fingers passed through the paper like morning mist. "It's from Cousin Charlotte." Isabella's eyes widened as she scanned the page. "She's engaged to Mr. Rothschild." "Well, that explains everything. Mama always did have designs on him for one of us." "I most certainly did," Mrs. Brockett seethed, "and that conniving little witch has stolen him right from under our noses." Mr. Brockett sighed, replacing his spectacles. "I suppose we should send word to the undertaker." "Undertaker?" Mrs. Brockett's voice rose to a pitch that would have shattered the finest crystal had anyone been able to hear it. "I absolutely forbid it. I am not dead." "I'll get the black crepe," Mabel offered with suspicious eagerness. "Been saving some special, I have." "You most certainly will not." Mrs. Brockett attempted to block the doorway, but Mabel walked straight through her. The sensation made Mrs. Brockett's ethereal form shudder with revulsion. "Should we not wait a while?" Marianne suggested. "To make absolutely certain. Remember when we thought the parson was dead last Easter? But he was just having a long nap during his sermon." "The parson wasn't blue," Isabella pointed out. "Blue?" Mrs. Brockett whirled to examine her physical form. "I am not blue. I am merely experiencing a temporary indisposition." But as she watched her family begin the preparations for her demise, Catherine weeping, Isabella sorting through papers, Marianne comparing different shades of black ribbon, and Mr. Brockett retiring to his study with suspicious haste, Mrs. Brockett was forced to acknowledge that something rather extraordinary had occurred. The letter from her niece lay abandoned on the floor, its contents mocking her even in what appeared to be death. Mrs. Brockett's spirit form vibrated with indignation. If she was indeed having some manner of otherworldly experience, she would jolly well make the most of it. After all, she thought, as she experimentally drifted through a wall, what was the point of being dead if one couldn't use it to one's advantage? Mrs. Brockett discovered that traversing distances in her ethereal state required merely a concentrated thought. One moment she was watching Mabel irreverently measure her physical form for a burial gown, and the next she found herself materializing in her niece's London townhouse. The drawing room of Charlotte's residence possessed a sophistication that made Mrs. Brockett's spectral form bristle with resentment. Delicate Chinese vases adorned marble-topped tables, and the upholstery showed not a single patch or repair. Charlotte sat surrounded by her family, positively glowing as she detailed her courtship with Mr. Rothschild. The man himself stood by the fireplace, cutting a dashing figure that only served to heighten Mrs. Brockett's fury. "Edmund insisted we tour his conservatory," Charlotte simpered. "He's cultivating the most extraordinary collection of exotic orchids." "Cultivating indeed," Mrs. Brockett muttered darkly, floating closer to examine her future nephew-in-law. "I'll wager it wasn't the orchids you were examining, you scheming little—" She stopped short, a wicked realization dawning. If she could pass through solid objects, what else might she accomplish? Testing her theory, she extended one ethereal finger and gave Mr. Rothschild a sharp poke in the ribs. He jerked suddenly, spilling his tea. "Edmund, darling, are you quite well?" Charlotte asked. "Perfectly fine, my dear. Just a slight chill." Mrs. Brockett's spirit form practically vibrated with malevolent glee. She positioned herself behind Mr. Rothschild and, summoning all her spectral energy, gave him an almighty shove. The unfortunate gentleman stumbled forward, arms windmilling, head first directly into the ample bosom of a passing maid carrying fresh tea. The ensuing chaos exceeded Mrs. Brockett's wildest hopes. "Edmund!" Charlotte shrieked, leaping to her feet. "How could you?" The maid, covered in tea and mortification, attempted to disentangle herself. "Sir, please!" I don't know what came over me," Mr. Rothschild stammered, his face crimson as he attempted to untangle his fingers from the lace of her bodice. "Some sort of force." "Force indeed," Charlotte's mother said icily, tightening up her own bodice to prevent any possible intrusion and taking several steps back. "Looks clearly to me like the force of base desires, Mr. Rothschild." Mrs. Brockett, thoroughly enjoying herself now, turned her attention to her niece. Charlotte's fashionable dress, with its intricate row of buttons down the back, presented an irresistible target. With ghostly precision, Mrs. Brockett began systematically unfastening them one by one. Charlotte shifted uncomfortably, reaching behind her. "What in heaven's name?" Not content with mere buttons, Mrs. Brockett located the crucial ribbon that held the entire ensemble together. With one decisive tug, she pulled it free, just as the door opened and a wealthy, single Lord Cavendish stepped in. "Dear lady!" Lord Cavendish recoiled, astonished at the sight of Charlotte's dress dropping to the floor, leaving her in nothing but undergarments. "I had no idea your feelings towards me were such. I must insist, however, that this is no proper way to advance them forwards. Not in present company, anyway." "Charlotte!" her mother shrieked. "What has possessed you?" "It's not me," Charlotte protested, frantically bending to clutch at her fallen garments. "It simply came undone." Lord Cavendish, known for several substantial estates, reached back for the door handle to make a hasty retreat. "Clearly I have called at an inopportune moment." "Oh, I'd say the timing is perfect," Mrs. Brockett cackled, thoroughly pleased with her handiwork. The drawing room erupted into chaos. Charlotte's mother nearly fainted, calling for smelling salts, while her father demanded to know what sort of hysteria the two gentlemen had introduced into their household. The maid fled in tears, and Charlotte's younger sister began to hiccup uncontrollably. Mr. Rothschild, too, edged towards the door, clearly reconsidering his matrimonial intentions. "Well," Mrs. Brockett declared to her unhearing audience, "I trust we've all learned a valuable lesson about poaching other people's matrimonial prospects." Charlotte attempted to rise, but Mrs. Brockett helpfully arranged some hem of her dress beneath her feet, causing her to stumble spectacularly into a display of precious porcelain. The crash of breaking china provided a satisfying punctuation to the scene. Mrs. Brockett surveyed the devastation with profound satisfaction, watching as her niece sat amid the wreckage of both her mother's best tea service and her own engagement aspirations. "I don't know what's come over me," Charlotte whimpered, her face streaked with tears. "Things have never come so fast undone in all my life." "Quite," her mother added pointedly from the couch, glaring in equal measure between her daughter and Mr. Rothschild. "As for you, sir, I dread to think quite how forward you must be with your own servants." Mr. Rothschild gave her a mortified look. "I believe," Charlotte's father said stiffly, "that any further correspondence regarding a potential engagement with my daughter can wait, if indeed such correspondence proves necessary at all, as I think quite enough has been said here today already." Mrs. Brockett followed Mr. Rothschild and Mr. Cavendish into the hallway, unable to resist delivering one final blow. As Mr. Rothschild reached for his hat, she caused it to skip just beyond his grasp several times before allowing it to roll down the front steps into a fresh pile of manure left by a waiting carriage horse. Returning to the drawing room, she found Charlotte dousing herself with laudanum, while her mother, clutching at the armrests, lamented the scandal. The younger sister had progressed from hiccups to a sort of wheezing giggle that showed no signs of abating. As she considered what further mischief she might accomplish, a curious sensation drew her attention upward. A pinprick of brilliant light had appeared near the ceiling, accompanied by what could only be described as a celestial voice. "Mrs. Penelope Brockett," it intoned, "your time has come. Step into the light." Mrs. Brockett squinted at the radiance. "That's rather bright, isn't it? Couldn't you dim it a touch?" "Step into the light." Yes, I heard you the first time," she huffed, examining the various light sources in the room. "Now, is it this fairly handsome gilt chandelier you're referring to, or perhaps that brass oil lamp in the corner?" The voice acquired a distinct note of impatience. "The divine light of celestial grace, Mrs. Brockett. The small but growing point of pure white radiance above your head." "Oh, that little thing? Well, why didn't you say so?" She drifted upward, pausing to cast one last look at her niece, who was now being fanned by 3 different people. "I suppose I have accomplished what I came for, though I must say the afterlife has proved far more entertaining than I expected." As Mrs. Brockett approached the light, she could have sworn she heard the celestial voice mutter something about trying times and hazard pay, but surely that was merely her imagination. The light enveloped Mrs. Brockett with what she considered unnecessary theatricality, drawing her into a tunnel of pure radiance. The effect, she decided, was rather like being swallowed by an over-enthusiastic sunrise. "Do walk forward," the voice instructed. "Your deceased relatives await." Mrs. Brockett peered down the length of the tunnel, where indeed several figures stood beckoning. "I suppose I must, though really this entire arrangement is most unsuitable for a lady of my standing, trudging about like some common wandering spirit. The path to eternal rest is the same for all souls," the voice intoned. "Well, it shouldn't be," Mrs. Brockett sniffed, picking her way forward with exaggerated care. "There ought to be some consideration for social rank, a sedan chair at the very least." As she approached the waiting figures, their features became clearer. There stood her grandmother, Aunt Prudence, and her father's cousin Bartholomew, among others. Their expressions bore a distinct lack of welcome that Mrs. Brockett found highly improper. "Penelope!" Her grandmother spoke first, her voice heavy with disappointment. "You have lived your life in a manner most unseemly." "I beg your pardon?" "Your treatment of others has been abominable," Aunt Prudence added. "The way you've browbeaten your family, terrorized your servants—" "Now see here," Mrs. Brockett interrupted. "I have maintained the highest standards of propriety and social conduct. If others found themselves wanting in comparison, that's hardly my concern." Cousin Bartholomew stepped forward. "You've shown no kindness, no compassion." "Kindness?" Mrs. Brockett's ethereal form practically crackled with indignation. "Let me tell you about kindness, Cousin Bartholomew. Was it kindness that prompted you to die without leaving me your collection of Georgian silver, after I spent 15 years complimenting those ghastly grape scissors?" She rounded on her grandmother. "And you! You had the audacity to expire just 2 days before Isabella's first season, forcing us into mourning at precisely the wrong moment. She could have been married to a baronet if it weren't for your inconsiderate timing." "Penelope, we're trying to help you understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly well, Aunt Prudence. You're jealous. You all are. None of you ever managed to maintain the social standards I achieved. Why, I remember that dinner party you hosted in 1802 where you served port before sherry. The scandal nearly ruined the family name." Her deceased relatives exchanged glances of deepening concern. "And another thing," Mrs. Brockett continued, warming to her subject. That bonnet you insisted on wearing in your final years, grandmother? It looked like something a deranged peacock might construct after imbibing too much sherry. I had to tell everyone you were suffering from brain fever to explain it away. The figures began to fade, their faces etched with sadness. Don't you dare disappear while I'm speaking to you! I haven't even addressed the matter of Uncle Frederick's notorious waistcoats or Cousin Margaret's deplorable habit of discussing politics at tea. But they continued to dissolve, leaving Mrs. Brocket alone in the tunnel of light. Well, not entirely alone. She could still sense the presence of the celestial voice hovering like an unwelcome draught in a poorly maintained drawing room. "They seemed rather sensitive," she remarked. "I suppose that's what comes of spending time in the afterlife. No backbone whatsoever." "They came to offer guidance," the voice responded, its tone suggesting divine patience wearing decidedly thin. "To help you reflect upon your earthly conduct." Reflect? I should think not. One doesn't maintain social order by reflecting. One maintains it through rigorous adherence to proper standards and the occasional strategic use of cutting remarks at tea parties. The tunnel of light seemed to pulse with divine exasperation. "Perhaps we should proceed to the next phase of your spiritual journey." "Oh, very well," Mrs. Brocket sighed. "Though I must say, this entire experience has been remarkably poorly organised. I would suggest, when arranging a gathering of souls, at least make an effort to provide proper seating and refreshments." "The celestial plane is not one of your social functions, Mrs. Brocket." "Clearly not. The lighting is far too harsh and the acoustics leave much to be desired. If you'd like, I could offer some suggestions for improvement. First, these tunnel walls—" "That will not be necessary." "Could benefit from some tasteful wallpaper. Nothing too bold, mind you, just a subtle pattern to break up all this monotonous glowing. And perhaps some occasional tables." "Mrs. Brocket—" "For resting one's ethereal form. I don't suppose you've considered installing a nice chaise longue." The light at the end of the tunnel flared suddenly, cutting off her interior decoration proposals. Mrs. Brocket found herself being drawn forward at an accelerated pace, her suggestions about proper furnishings for the afterlife trailing behind her like forgotten spirits. "I do hope," she managed as the light grew blindingly bright, "that wherever we're going has better taste in decor than this passage. Though given the evidence thus far, I shan't hold my breath. Not that I appear to be breathing anyway." The celestial voice's response was lost in the overwhelming radiance, but Mrs. Brocket could have sworn it sounded remarkably like a divine sigh of resignation. The blinding light coalesced into a vast, ethereal chamber that Mrs. Brocket immediately deemed lacking in architectural merit. Before she could voice her critique, the divine presence manifested with renewed authority. "Penelope Brocket," the voice boomed, "your life's actions have caused great distress to those around you. Observe." A shimmering vision materialized before her, showing a younger Mrs. Brocket at Isabella's 10th birthday celebration. "Oh, not this!" Mrs. Brocket protested. In the scene, young Isabella proudly presented a watercolour she had painted. "Mama, look what I made for you!" The younger Mrs. Brocket barely glanced at the artwork. "Really, Isabella, such childish pursuits. Lady Uppington's daughter is already accomplished at the pianoforte. I suppose we must resign ourselves to your mediocrity." The vision showed Isabella's face crumpling as she fled the room. "Well, really," present-day Mrs. Brocket huffed. "It was a dreadful painting. The trees were entirely the wrong shade of green. Besides, she needed to develop a thicker skin." "You crushed her creative spirit," the voice admonished. I prevented her from making a fool of herself in society. She should thank me. The scene shifted to Marianne's first dinner party. The girl had just finished telling what she thought was an amusing story about a duck wearing a bonnet. "Marianne," Mrs. Brocket's past self cut in, "if you cannot contribute something worthwhile to the conversation, I suggest you remain silent. Your peculiar notions are making our guests uncomfortable." "But I thought—" "No, dear, you didn't think. That's rather the problem, isn't it?" Present-day Mrs. Brocket nodded approvingly. "Sound advice. Though she never did learn, still natters on about the most nonsensical things." The third vision showed Catherine discovering her private journal had been read and critiqued in red ink. "Your romantic drivel required correction," past Mrs. Brocket declared. "Really, Catherine, no gentleman of quality would ever ride through a storm to deliver a love letter. They have servants for such things." "Those corrections saved her from a lifetime of unrealistic expectations," Mrs. Brocket declared. "I was performing a service." The fourth scene revealed Mrs. Brocket berating Mabel for failing to repair the roof during a thunderstorm. "I don't care if you've never done it before. A properly trained servant should be able to manage basic household maintenance in any weather. Now get up there before the library floods." "She survived, didn't she?" Present-day Mrs. Brocket sniffed. "Though she never did fix that leak properly." The final vision showed Mr. Brocket attempting to read in his study while Mrs. Brocket detailed her plans to sabotage a rival's garden party. "If we release some sheep into Mrs. Dashwood's rose garden the night before, her horticultural society presentation will be ruined. That will teach her to serve better tea than mine at the parish committee meeting." Mr. Brocket's expression of weary resignation spoke volumes. "Those roses were garish anyway," present Mrs. Brocket declared. "The sheep showed remarkably good taste." The visions faded, and the divine presence seemed to gather itself. "Do you feel no remorse for the pain you have caused?" "Remorse?" Mrs. Brocket scoffed. "I have maintained standards in a world determined to lower them. If feelings were bruised in the process, that merely proves how necessary my efforts were." "Your actions have brought suffering." "My actions have brought order," Mrs. Brocket interrupted. "Do you know what would happen if everyone simply did as they pleased? We'd have chaos. People writing whatever they like in journals, telling absurd stories at dinner parties, and painting trees in unnatural shades of green. Is that what you want?" There was a profound silence in the celestial chamber. "Furthermore," Mrs. Brocket continued, warming to her subject, "I have sacrificed my own comfort countless times in service of propriety. Do you think I enjoyed having to snub the butcher's wife at church? Or pretend I couldn't hear Mabel's endless complaints about climbing onto rain-slicked roofs? The burden of maintaining social order is a heavy one, but someone must bear it." The divine presence seemed to pulse with what might have been a celestial headache. "Your lack of compassion is perfectly justified," Mrs. Brocket finished. "Really, if you're going to judge people's earthly conduct, you might want to consider the challenges we face. Do you know how difficult it is to find good help these days? Or to maintain one's position in society when surrounded by people who think it's acceptable to serve fish with the wrong sauce?" The chamber's radiance flickered, as if the divine light itself was having second thoughts about this entire encounter. "Mrs. Brocket," the voice said finally, "your soul requires—" "Better company than I've been shown thus far," she interjected. "Really, if this is the standard of the afterlife, I must say I'm rather disappointed. No proper seating, endless lectures about compassion, and relatives who can't take even the mildest criticism about their fashion choices. Most unsatisfactory. The light began to pulse in a manner suggesting divine patience had reached its limit. "Mrs. Brocket," the divine voice declared, "after careful consideration, I have decided to return you to the earthly plane." "Oh? Had a change of heart about my social contributions, have you?" "Not exactly." The voice seemed to choose its words with celestial diplomacy. "Let us say that heaven might benefit from additional preparation before accommodating your particular character." "Well, I should think so. The current arrangements are hardly suitable for—" "However," the voice continued hastily, "before you return—" "One moment," Mrs. Brockett interrupted. "Since I have your attention, there are several matters regarding your creation that I feel compelled to address." The divine presence dimmed slightly, as if attempting to retreat. "Firstly," Mrs. Brockett began, "weather. The rain in England is entirely excessive. A light shower for the gardens between 4 and 5 in the morning would suffice. Anything more is simply showing off." "Mrs. Brockett, this is not—" "Secondly, the human digestive system, most inefficient. Mabel's stomach is forever gurgling during crucial moments while serving at tea parties. Surely you could have designed something more discreet." A faint sound, rather like divine teeth being ground together, echoed through the chamber. "Thirdly, whoever decided that young ladies should have opinions needs a stern talking to. My daughters were perfectly manageable until they developed the ability to think." "That is not—" "And servants' hearing. It's far too acute. They should be deaf to all conversation above their station. Would save no end of trouble with gossip." The celestial light began to flicker in what might have been divine distress. "Oh, and the aging process seems completely backwards. If one could start old and proper, then gradually become young and foolish when it no longer matters. I'm not sure quite how you could work it, but overall, I believe it would be much more sensible." "Mrs. Brockett, please. And did I mention? Social seasons. They are far too short. By the time one has properly arranged all the necessary introductions and strategic seating plans, it's over. 3 additional months would be much more practical." The divine presence seemed to be looking for an escape route. "Then there's the human capacity for embarrassing relatives, which should be kept limited. 1 black sheep per family is quite sufficient for character building. Any more is simply greedy." "That's not how it—" "And sunrise, quite consistently too early, especially in the summer. 9 o'clock would be far more civilized. And while we're discussing the sun, its tendency to fade fabric is most inconsiderate." The chamber's radiance had dimmed to a desperate glimmer. "It should also not go amiss that the entire concept of social mobility needs revision. People should remain exactly where they're put. All this climbing up and down the social ladder makes proper table arrangements nearly impossible." "Please stop." "And finally," Mrs. Brockett drew herself up to her full ethereal height, "the distribution of wealth among the nobility is deeply flawed. Those with the finest manners should have the largest fortunes. Instead, we have situations where people like my niece can secure wealthy matches while serving fish with inappropriate sauces." There was a moment of profound celestial silence. "Are you quite finished?" the voice asked weakly. "For the moment, though I do have some additional thoughts about the impractical nature of rose thorns." "No!" the divine presence rallied itself. "Mrs. Brockett, you are hereby returned to your earthly form. May heaven preserve us. I mean, may you have a meaningful continuation of your mortal existence."
Before Mrs. Brockett could expound on her theories regarding the unnecessary complexity of butterfly migration patterns, she felt herself being rather hastily propelled downward. She opened her eyes to find herself back on the fainting couch, surrounded by her still fussing family.
"Oh!" Catherine exclaimed. "Mama's alive!"
"Of course I'm alive," Mrs. Brockett snapped, sitting up and straightening her dress. "Though no thanks to any of you, standing about like useless ornaments." The family gaped as she rose to her feet. "Marianne, fetch my writing desk. I have several strongly worded letters to compose regarding recent events in London. Isabella, your posture is atrocious. Catherine, stop crying this instant. Henry, continue whatever newspaper it is you're reading. And Mabel—" The maid poked her head around the door. "Law, she's back then."
"Ah,
"Dearest Mabel," Mrs. Brockett said with a deadly look in her eye, beckoning to the maid. She produced a handful of sludge she'd scraped off from the side of her face. "You'd best sleep with one, if not two, eyes open for the remainder of your employment under my roof." The sludge went flying in Mabel's direction, who dodged it with practiced agility. Mrs. Brockett huffed and fixed her family with an imperious stare. "We must redouble our efforts. This family's aspirations cannot be thwarted by mere death. We have standards to maintain and social heights yet to scale with all the fervour we can muster. Now, where is that towel?" As her family scrambled to comply with her directives, or at least flee the scene in search of suitable hiding places, Mrs. Brockett allowed herself a moment for a small smile of satisfaction. She had faced down death itself and found it wanting. More importantly, she had gained renewed determination for her future aspirations and satisfactorily sabotaged her niece's engagement prospects in the process. Really, she thought as she began composing a letter calculated to scandalize 3 counties, the day had turned out rather well after all. Some distance off, in the celestial realm, a divine presence was hurriedly revising its policies regarding the admission of especially difficult souls, and seriously considering the installation of some tasteful wallpaper.